I'll start by saying that if you interest yourself in the history of ideas or the history of the development of science in the 19th century, sooner or later you have to come across the name of Alfred Russel Wallace, and sooner or later you come across the connection he had with Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. If you delve a little bit deeper into Wallace's career, you discover that he was very interested in all sorts of fringe ideas. Spiritualism, for instance, we've already heard about some of that this morning. And that caused his reputation to kind of drop down with men of science. But then if you carry on interesting yourself in Wallace, you discover that he espoused many causes that today we take for granted, like the women's movement, equality of women, that any sort of well-regulated mind now would just take for granted. But in the 19th century, it was seen as outrageous, even dangerous. So Wallace was the champion of what were, in his own times, many very, very unpopular causes. Gradually, because of perhaps these things, his star fell, and through much of the 20th century, his name became little more than a footnote in the story of Charles Darwin. All these aspects of his career have been studied with increasing frenzy in recent years because Wallace has once again become fashionable. But what was it that formed his egalitarian opinions, his poetic way of writing, his sophisticated ideas? Even though some of them may have been quite naive, many of them were seriously sophisticated. What was it that triggered his extraordinary march into history? I think that essentially it can be put down to two factors. First, of course, was his own natural ability and instincts. That's obvious. But second was a very, very curious and to us strange fashion. And that was the fashion for the relics of natural history. The family were well educated, and Alfred, as a young man, was encouraged to read widely. And he fell under the influence of social reformers like Robert Owen and political revolutionaries like Thomas Paine, who of course was so important in the American Constitution. But because the family were comparatively poor, and they lived in an age when influence and prestige meant so much, his choice of career was somewhat limited. And I think that it was perhaps this very disadvantage that led him to become the man that he was. At a comparatively early age, and inspired by the memoirs of explorers and travellers and his meeting with Bates, Henry Bates, who was spoken to you about this morning, he dreamed up a realistic way for a poor boy to kind of earn a living in a reasonably regular way from having a life of adventure. What he thought he would do, he would travel to far off parts of the world, dangerous and remote places, and there he would hunt for birds, for mammals, for insects. He'd find a way to preserve them, and he'd send them back to Britain. In this case, it could have been to America, but in this case it was to Britain, where they could be sold for fairly encouraging sums of money. Now, if we look at that idea today, it sounds ridiculous. To gain any real insight into what fired Wallace up in the first place and allowed him to become the person he was, you have to understand how fashionable the relics of natural history were. The products of the natural world were so much in vogue and so much in fashion that they aroused a frenzy of interest. Nowadays, we tend to think of skeletons, stuffed birds, specimens of giant squids, things like that, as essentially the preserve of museums or institutions. But during the 19th century, this was certainly not the case. In Britain, for instance, homes ranging from humble country cottages to the great stately houses would regularly have, as part of their normal interior decor, things like this: specimens of stuffed birds arranged in wonderful showy cases that have the superficial resemblance of life, and yet they're entirely decorative. Every home in the land had something like this. The more colourful the display, the better. Of course, the scale of the piece was very much determined by the means of the household, and a poor cottage might just have something like a relatively unambitious case with an owl or a squirrel, in this case a sparrowhawk, that's what we call those birds in England, just in a plain picture frame glass mounted case. A wealthier household would have something more like this. This wonderful confection, it's got 2 quetzals, which would have been imported to Britain from Central America, and they are displayed in this glass dome that would be 3 feet high, that big. So it was a very spectacular addition to any household. A really, really wealthy household would have something like this incredibly elaborate case that has more than 300 hummingbirds in it. The case is 5 feet high, 3.5 feet wide. And it would have obviously been enormously expensive in its day. His first collecting trip took him to South America, where he went in company of the now celebrated naturalist Henry Bates. And this particular display cabinet, although it has no actual connection with Wallace, at least none that we know of, this particular case serves to give some idea of the kind of life that Wallace was leading. Let us for a moment ignore our present day sensibilities, ignore our discomfort over the killing of wild animals and birds. Try to enter into the mindset of the time. Imagine that it is the year 1850, the approximate time when this case was produced and the approximate time when Wallace was in South America. Imagine that you are somewhere in the wilds of South America. You are trying to earn a living as a collector of specimens to send back to Europe or the US. Imagine you've just received a commission, let's say from London, to collect enough hummingbirds to fill that case. There are several important conditions would be attached to this commission. The first would be that you've got to trap all these birds without leaving any kind of mark of violence on them. The second is that they have to belong to various different species, many different species. They don't all want the same one. So that means you might have to travel hundreds of miles to find different localities where the different species lived. Then you'd have to find different trapping stratagems to enable you to trap these different birds that occupied different environments and lived different kinds of lives. The third requirement is perhaps even darker than the other two, because that is, you've got to find a way of killing these birds that will leave no marks of external violence upon them. Once all this has been done, the executions have been accomplished, then you've got to find a way of skinning the fragile little creatures before they rot in the hot tropical sun. And when you skin them, you've got to keep all the feathers attached. So this is a very delicate and tricky process. So many of the birds that you've caught and killed are going to be damaged in various ways, can't be used. They're going to have to be thrown out. There are more than 300 birds in this particular case, but probably maybe 1,000 individuals would have needed to be caught and killed to provide those 300 birds, because perhaps less than half would remain in exquisite condition. So an inspection takes place. Wallace would have inspected what he'd done, and he would have selected 300 or 400 to pack, carefully crate up, and send back to London. These were the sort of problems that confronted Wallace. Whether we like it or not, that's what he did. This very kind, sweet man in many ways killed thousands of birds. You just have to face that fact. That is a fact. But what was all the effort for? Who was his commission from? So let's now shift the scene several thousand miles to London. And the destination of that particular crate of birds that supplied that case was headed for Grosvenor Square, one of the most fashionable parts of London. In fact, it's so fashionable that now that's where the US Embassy is. And there, in those days in the 19th century, a taxidermist had his headquarters. And that's where those particular birds went to. And it may be a little bit unfair to make a rather illustrious comparison, but that taxidermist operated in much the same way as certain great artists of the past. Peter Paul Rubens, Jacques-Louis David, for instance. They operated from the most illustrious parts of town. They had the same sort of clientele as that taxidermist would have had, the super rich and the fashion conscious. They also had assistants. So did the man who made that. Many assistants that were learning from the great master himself, the man that owned the taxidermy company. So, in a way, this may not be art, I'm not trying to suggest it is, but in a way, this man was operating and had the same kind of prestige at that time as great artists had. It lasted until the First World War, 1914. After the Great War, fashions changed. Natural history collecting dropped out of fashion. Taxidermy dropped out of fashion. And the situation became very, very much the one that we would recognize today. So anyway, the world in which Wallace hoped to earn a living and the world which shaped his ideas and his success was a very different shape to our own. It was also different, of course, in terms of hardship and danger. When Wallace went to the places where birds like that existed, he was on his own. He had no aeroplane, he had no GPS, he had no mobile phone to get him out of trouble, no tour operator to plan his route. Only very rarely did he have access to anything that we would recognize as a hotel. He had nothing but his own wit and determination. Once he left Britain, he was on his own in a world of hurt. And a less sensitive person than Wallace may have treated the primitive peoples he came across with contempt, or maybe with fear, or maybe even cruelty. But Wallace, for all that he killed all these birds, was not an insensitive man. He had one of the fundamental ingredients of humanity, and that was empathy. And this quality, along with the varied experiences that he had, enabled him to write a marvelous and groundbreaking book that those of you who are here this morning have already heard about, the Malay Archipelago. He wrote this when he finally returned home. And it's a book that not only has vivid descriptions of his travels, but it also has many very sophisticated and illuminating ideas. And what you have to remember, when Wallace went to the Malay Archipelago, same as when he went to South America, no one could have survived in such hostile situations, often surrounded by highly aggressive tribespeople. No one could have survived in that situation without the ability to make immediate friends and make people warm to them. And one of Wallace's greatest talents was the ability to engage people and quickly gain their respect and their trust. Over and over again, his writings reveal that native peoples grew to almost see him as one of their own. And it's surely this natural empathy that in later life led him to espouse all the causes of egalitarianism that he did. Now, this picture was painted by the well-known artist Raymond Ching as a kind of tribute to Wallace and his discovery of the birds of paradise. And these were the creatures that perhaps entranced him more than any others. It's a kind of visual poem about the discovery of birds of paradise and how they were brought to Europe as cabinet skins in this area here in the middle. And in the painting, they're surrounded by a great flotilla or armada of more common birds. 3 of the birds of paradise are rising up alive as if from the dead skins that Wallace would have prepared. And I'll come on to that in just a moment. And on it are scribbled, on the painting are scribbled various words of Wallace's. And in my view, nothing highlights the rapport that Wallace could establish with primitive peoples than an extract from his most famous book. And it shows absolutely the closeness of relationship he was able to bring about and the feeling of warmth that these people had for him. And I'm going to read it to you in a moment. And I want you to imagine the situation. Wallace is alone. Not exactly. He's surrounded by tribesmen in New Guinea who were almost certainly given over to cannibalistic habits. Almost certainly they could kill him if they chose at any given moment, just on a whim. Yet these strange, primitive, hostile, desperately dangerous people liked him so much that they wanted to understand him. They even wanted to be able to tell stories about him after he was gone. And the fact that they knew he would one day go was something of a sadness to them. And their attitude to preserve bird specimens and their mystification about the idea that anyone might want to see these things is not so very dissimilar to the attitudes that many people have today. But this formidable group of men surrounding Wallace were prepared to forgive lies that they believed he was telling them. He wasn't, but they believed he was. And these are Wallace's own words. In many ways, They tell the story of this painting, and they also tell, I think, something important about Wallace's own character and what made him the man he was. This is what he wrote. Several men of Aru, which is an island just off the coast of New Guinea, begged me for the 20th time to tell them the name of my country. Then, as they could not pronounce it, they insisted that I was deceiving them. Imagine that. They think he's lying to them, and he's surrounded by these men with bones through their noses, plumes, spears, armed to the teeth. They insisted I was deceiving them. That the name of my country was a name of my own invention. One old man was indignant. Anglang, he said. Who ever heard of such a name? Anglang. That cannot be the name of your country. Then he tried to give a convincing demonstration. My country is Wanumbai. Anybody can say Wanumbai. But England, who ever heard of such a name? Do tell us the name of your country. Then, when you are gone, we shall know how to talk about you. The whole party remained convinced I was deceiving them. They then attacked me on another point. What all the animals and birds were preserved so carefully for. What's the point of them? I tried to explain. They would be stuffed and made to look as if they were still alive. And people in my country would go to look at them. But this was not satisfying. They looked at me with utter disbelief. In my country, there must be many, many better things to look at. They, the cannibals from Aru, did not want to look at these things, these birds. And we, the people of my country, who made calico and glass and knives and all sorts of wonderful things, we couldn't want birds from Aru to look at. It was ridiculous. The old man said to me in a very low, mysterious voice, "What becomes of them when you take them on the sea?" "Why, they are all packed up in boxes," I said, "created to be sent back to my home." He shook his head. "But what did you think became of them?" said I. "They all come to life again, don't they?" said the old man. And he kept repeating with an air of deep conviction, "Yes, they all come to life again. That's what they do. They all come to life again." Thank you very much.